Call me weird, but I enjoy thunderstorms. But not after what happened to my roommate. This is my true thunderstorm horror story. So sit tight and never come out. I was living in a college dorm when this happened. It was my senior year in high school, and I was living with a good buddy named Kevin, whom I had met the previous year. When I went out of class, I noticed that the sky was really gloomy. The pressure was lowering, and I could tell that a storm was on its way. At that time, I decided to go to the coffee shop where I usually studied. I assumed that most students would be returning to their hostels and that the place would be deserted. I was correct about the place being vacant. There were only me and one other person in the store aside from the two staff, one on the bookstore register and the other a barista. I set my belongings on a table directly by the window and watched the storm from there. I was astonished to find my dorm roommate outdoors in the rain when I looked out the window. He didn't even have an umbrella and was completely drenched from head to toe. He was on the other side of the street. He came to a halt in front of a store and looked back and forth a few times. He then turned and proceeded back the way he had come. I thought that was strange, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. Perhaps he was trapped in the rain and decided that since he was already saturated, he might as well continue walking. I saw him again about a half hour later. He didn't turn around this time, and he kept going in the same way. Perhaps he forgot something the first time. I'm not really sure. However, the fact that he had been strolling around in the rain for such a long time without an umbrella troubled me. I stood up, walked up to the bookshop's cafe entrance, opened it, and searched for him. I couldn't find him anywhere. I texted him as soon as I returned to the store, but I didn't expect to hear back from him. I informed him that I was at the cafe and questioned what he was doing wandering around in the rain. It seemed improbable that he would be able to text back on his smartphone if he was soaking wet. When it stopped pouring, I went back to my dorm room. The sky was still gloomy, and it was clear that the storm had not passed. But I felt like returning to the safety of my room. I was also interested in what was going on with my roommate. I texted Kevin numerous times. I never received an answer. He never returned to the dorm either. A missing persons report was eventually filed. This happened 6 years ago, and neither I nor Kevin's family have heard from him since. Here's a spine-chilling story to keep you up during the storm. The show only gets scarier from here, so if you dare, keep watching. Do you believe in unseen entities in empty places? I do. This is my scary, rainy story that I will never forget. I used to live quite a distance from school when I was a teenager. My parents both worked late into the evening. I could probably count the number of times my parents drove me to or from school on one hand. I was unquestionably a bus kid. During my freshman and sophomore years of high school, my school would operate an additional bus fee after school for kids who needed to remain late for whatever reason. However, just before my junior year, financial constraints led me to not avail the service anymore. Because most kids lived in town, they could walk home if necessary. A storm had been developing all day on the day this story took place. I found myself glancing out the window more than anything else throughout each lecture. I kept praying it would go away. When it hadn't by my last class, I had to choose between taking the bus home or walking home in the rain. Clearly, I elected to take my chances and walk. When I got out of the drama class, I felt fortunate. Despite the fact that clouds had been gathering all day, no rain had fallen. I just hoped it would last another couple of hours or so I could get home nice and early. But, as fate would have it, not even 20 minutes into my stroll, little raindrops began to fall. When a beautiful drizzle threatened to develop into something worse, I chose to go via this gated property that was home to an ancient abandoned factory. It wasn't fenced, but there were plenty of signs around the property warning kids not to trespass. However, traveling through it would shorten my trek and maybe allow me to beat the rain. I wasn't even halfway around the property when the rain started. Accepting that I would get wet but not saturated, I dashed straight for the factory. I know a lot of people get a rush from being inside abandoned buildings, but I'm not one of them. It was filthy, covered with graffiti and littered with empty beer bottles. This undoubtedly suggested that it was a popular drinking establishment for youths. I believed I heard something coming from within the plant at that point. Following that, there was a tremendous boom of thunder. I heard it, but didn't pay attention the first time. But then it happened again. Something was moving in a neighboring room, according to the sound. I told myself it was most likely a snake or a rat, but I also noticed the storm was rather loud. Whatever I was hearing was far larger than that. I thought about simply rushing back into the storm, but it was really starting to rain now. I would have been completely submerged in an instant, and what I was hearing may have been nothing significant. It may have been a cat. And I determined it was most likely a feline. Another ear-shattering thunderclap rang out. Then I heard what sounded like a horrible groan or something. I reasoned that I must have gotten into something I shouldn't have. I was ready to leave and head out in the rain when I heard the noise again and decided to follow it to see what was going on. My heart was pounding as I stepped around the corner. I noticed the open door to the room and, after a little pause, turned the corner and peered inside. I was startled to see a girl my age in the room. Her wrists and feet were bound, and she was gagged. She had a terrified expression on her face as she glanced at me. After a brief moment of reflection, I dashed over to her and began untying her. When I ungagged her, she hugged me like she knew who I was. She then stood up and demanded that we leave the building immediately. I attempted to get her to explain, but she ignored me. We both dashed into the rain and were quickly wet. We were closer to the school than my house, so when she phoned the cops, we rushed back there. The girl had been kidnapped by 3 men and left there while they went to get some beer, but the men didn't come back at all. She stayed there for 2 weeks, gagged and tied with no food or water. It was strange that she survived, but she said that something has been keeping her safe inside the factory. She never elaborated, but after days of being saved by the cops, she eventually returned to the old factory and decided to live there. Strange. Enjoy a scary tale while you wait out the storm. To those who are brave enough, the show will only get more terrifying from here on out. When I was younger, there was a man who lived across the street from me. Nobody knew anything about him, or at the very least, we didn't know anything about him. He was the boogeyman of our neighborhood. But looking at his residence and his actions, it seemed comprehensible. His home was rather ancient. It hadn't been painted in a long time. A handful of the windows were covered with old plastic that had been there for a long time. Of course, no children had ever played on it because children would seldom, if ever, go into his yard. There were also some antique toys and decorations in the yard. On his doorway stood an old tricycle with a plastic reindeer laying on its side. And there were more of them in the yard. Mr. Allen was the man's name. I'm not sure what his first name was, since I would have never wondered what an adult's name was at that time. He was an elderly man, most likely in his late 60s. He was bald with a little gray on the sides and back. Naturally, there were many stories regarding Mr. Allen. The most common was that he had murdered his wife and son many years before. He had gotten away with it on a technicality and was shunned by the community. When passing by his residence, People would frequently hear pounding and power tools. This would frequently occur at night, when blue light shone through his windows. It's strange that a man would undertake that kind of labor in the middle of the night, but we had no idea what type of work he did because he never spoke to anyone. I was a latchkey child when I was 12 years old. The school bus dropped me off one day while a rainstorm was approaching. I dashed into the house and shut the door behind me, primarily relieved that I wouldn't get wet. The storm eventually broke around an hour later. It was virtually dark, but it was sometimes illuminated by a dazzling flash of lightning, followed by loud thunder. I'm not sure if Will was too old to be terrified of thunderstorms, but I'm sure I was terrified. When I arrived home, I always shut the door. I sat on the couch, covered myself in a blanket, and tried to ignore the fact that it was raining outside by watching television. The lights and TV flickered for about 20 minutes after the storm began until the power went off. The home was deafeningly quiet. I was afraid, but I kept telling myself there was nothing to worry about. I'm not sure what prompted me to do it, other than the fact that when the power goes out, people have a propensity to go outside to see if it's just them or the entire neighborhood. But I mustered the courage to stand and walk over to the window beside the front entrance. Looking out the window, I noticed Mr. Allen's porch lights were turned on. He was powered by electricity. I looked to the side of the home and noticed that their porch lights were turned on. It was only me. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky and the entire neighborhood in an instant I'll never forget. Mr. Allen was strolling up the sidewalk on the side of my house at the time. He was barely on our property for a few seconds, but he was there. He might have turned off our power coming from the rear of the house. Fearful, I dashed over the couch and nestled back up under my blanket. I soon heard someone attempting to turn my doorknob. It was locked, but it still rattled a little. I hadn't, however, hooked the bolt. With every nerve I could muster, I dashed over to the door, bolted it, and dashed back to the couch. Another bolt of lightning struck, and I saw someone approaching the door through the glass. I knew it was Mr. Allen and that he was attempting to enter the residence. I grabbed the phone and dialed my father's number. He said he'd contact the cops and go home as soon as possible. He instructed me to go into his bedroom and lock myself in. That's what I did. I was on the bed, terrified of any noise. I eventually heard the door open. When I heard someone racing up the stairs, I was afraid. However, I was pleased when I heard my father urge me to open the door. Mr. Allen had already departed when he arrived. I presume he hadn't tried to break into the residence. I doubt the cops who even believed me when they came. They were aware of the legends surrounding the elderly guy. My father, on the other hand, informed me that someone had unlocked the power box outside and flicked the switch that switched off the power. As a result, they walked over to Mr. Allen and chatted with him. My father also spoke with him. They never informed me what they discussed, and Mr. Allen never returned to the house. But the few times I saw him, he always gave me a look that made my blood run cold. So, every time there was a thunderstorm, I would always remember Mr. Allen and how I escaped that treacherous night. One thing is certain, there is something scarier than the stories in this video. And it is what your life would be like if you didn't watch more of our videos.